This is Gene DeLisio with a featured sports interview from WDLB and WOSQ. Bill Kraemer was a standout lineman on the Marshfield Tiger football team in 1969 and 1970. Bill was named All-Conference Honorable Mention at center and defensive tackle in 1969, All-Conference First Team at center in 1970, and Honorable Mention as a defensive lineman in 1970 as well. Bill then played college football at UW-La Crosse and was inducted into the Marshfield Tiger Athletic Hall of Fame in 2009.
Well, I'm completely humbled and honored by this really unbelievable honor. I've won many honors in my career so far, and this by and far seems to touch a part of my heartstrings that basically few have. And I think the key thing is that there's always a special part in people's hearts when you put that much effort and that much emotion into something as a young athlete. And I think it's just absolutely unbelievable, and it's been just a great honor to see all the other fantastic people that have already been honored as such. And again, I give my analogy that I get at my presentation that it really felt the same way I felt when I won my first letter at Marshfield High School, and you get to wear your letter coat now with your letter on, and it took me about 2-3 weeks before I felt worthy enough to walk around the high school with it. So from that standpoint, very humbled, very honored, and a very, very special part of my life.
What are some of the early memories you have about athletics in Marshfield, maybe even before you went to high school, maybe watching some teams play as you were a young man growing up in this town?
Well, I think I grew up in this town. I went to Sacred Heart School as a young athlete, and Howard Metz, the fire chief at the time, we had our football team, of which many of the athletes went on to Columbus High School. I remember watching many of the great athletes, such as you look at across the board, even like Bobby Cuck at the time, the Cuck brothers at Columbus High School, which really dominated sport in football. But I think what happened is Marshfield had a tremendous amount of hardworking people, and we went through a lot of transitions. So I think I'm really a function, too, of growing up as a Green Bay Packer fan. I spent my early years living in Green Bay and being able to go over and watch, my first recollection of what football was basically watching a TV when I was about 8 years old and saying, what is that? Well, that's the Green Bay Packers. And then we, having lived there and then moving to Marshfield from Green Bay, football always played a very special role. And as the 60s progressed, I think everybody realizes that you can see it's very easy to become football as a religion almost from that. But I think it was really interesting in the early years to see the progression of all the different teams in the city, and I think Marshfield High School made a lot of had hard times and progressed now as time has gone on.
What are some of the early memories of football that you have in this town, maybe perhaps playing for Sacred Heart back as a young man?
Well, I remember, I guess the thing I remember most about football was I have the helmet collection today of many people and things that bother me, that basically have interacted with over the years. I remember the sport itself was very intriguing for a young man. I think the bottom line is that it was something that allowed a young kid to let himself out. I was a heavy kid when I was very young, and it was through football that I got the idea of physical conditioning and weight training. And Howard Metz, being a former Marine Corps sergeant or something, he put us through the conditioning phase, and then going on into high school, I think that's the thing that separated me, as there were only a handful of players, including Rick Griffin at Marshfield High School and Keith Sweat, that at that time trained with weights, and other people in the conference such as Mike Webster, who went on to great fame at Wisconsin and with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and a couple others that were really training with weights to the extent that you could remold your body. But I think it's just the transition of how players and athletes make changes in their life is really interesting. But I think memories of the athlete go back to plays that occurred. I remember our first victory against Eau Claire North. and breaking the long losing streak, which ended in a tremendous amount of elation, which probably for one game was probably too much, but basically it started us on a winning ways that would eventually progress the high school's football program to where it is today. So there's just a lot of excitement, but it's mostly about the people you played with, the different athletes that you played with, including Rick Griffin, Heath Sweat, Terry Buss, Ken Shunk, Mike Salter. All these people really played a pivotal role of athletes you remember achieving things with. So I think that's what's important. It's about the people.
When you got to Marshfield High School, began playing football, the football program was not having a great deal of success. They had a couple of winless seasons. I'm sure that things were very tough. What was the attitude, the feelings amongst the players walking into a situation like that?
Well, I think when you're young, you don't really understand it as much with the maturity that maybe if you were older. I think we always tried to win. Even during the times when we had no wins an entire season, I was on a college team that won 3 championships. And I really believe that the only difference is the number of high-quality players that you put on the field, and especially in skill positions. And so I think the attitude was that basically we were trying our best, but many times we were just outmanned. So I think this is something that was really difficult for some players that maybe went through their entire high school career and never won a game. And that's why by the time Jack Jansen came in my junior year, which was 1969, I believe, we basically started to have to build that we can possibly win a game. And I certainly could identify with what the Detroit Lions have gone through in the current year. But eventually, we got a belief in ourselves. We got some players. We had basically a system that would work against people that had potentially more physical and numbers of talent. And we ended up winning some games that year and then continuing on with more wins the next year. But it really is about the talent, and it's about the players, and about a solid coaching strategy to put them in the right place at the right time. And that's really what it was about.
One question I'd like to ask you, and I guess I got to ask this rather gingerly, but if you ask most people and mention the name Paul Richards, they would say, yeah, he's the guy that didn't win a game. He's here 3 years, did not win a football game. But as a player for him, you got to know this man personally, and although his one-loss record was certainly not outstanding, I'm sure he had a lot of positive attributes as well. Can you talk about what kind of man Mr. Richards was and some of the positive things that he did bring to the town?
Well, I think I only knew Coach Richards as a sophomore in high school, and one that was, so my perspective on Paul Richards really looks at it from that perspective. I think the major issue in retrospect was the fact that he came from a large school, at least he came from the Twin Cities, I believe, if I recollect it right, and they were used to doing power football, and the systems that he brought in at that particular time were not going to match up with what the personnel we had. So I think we had a personnel mismatch in that particular time. I think that he had a desire to win. I don't think he didn't want to win. I think there was just the fact that it got to be very difficult, and I think it caused him more consternations in trying to understand what was going on and really what was happening. But I think ultimately what he didn't understand was we just didn't have the physical talent to play the type of football and the type of schemes that was being played in Wisconsin Valley at that time, which was a very talented, fast, and large type of conference with really good players. D.C. Everest, Anago, at the time were the powerhouses. They played platoon football at that time, and I think it just was a function of the systems and our talent, and I think that's part of the problem.
I'd like to have you talk, if you would. Let's kind of pause the story for a moment and talk about how you got interested in weight training and how you developed that in an era that was maybe a few years ahead of the curve. I remember when I began broadcasting in the mid-'70s, there were schools just starting to get into that, and here you're ahead of that somewhat. Talk about how you developed this and how this became such an important part of your football career.
Well, I think first of all, I always had the interest to get better, and I think the problem was the only way you can get better is really through physical conditioning. And at the time, there was a lot of controversy about what you do. You run, you sprint. Road work was the thing that most people talked about from what boxers used to do, go out on the road and run 3-4 miles. Well, it turned out that's probably the worst thing you can do. You need probably interval sprint training, but road work probably makes you slower, which we know scientifically now as a professor and scientist of that, it does. I got interested in it basically because I had heard that Jimmy Taylor of the Green Bay Packers was very into weight training, and one of the reasons for his success. And basically he had a strength coach by the name of Alvin Roy, who was one of the first strength coaches in the field. And I went down as a 7th grader, and I actually bought some Sears Roebuck's weights. I convinced my dad that I needed weights. And so I think the genre really came out of what I could learn from what he did. And then I would read at the time, which is very different than today, Muscle and Fitness, and Bob Hoffman's Strength and Health. So I got interested in those type of things as well. And I read magazines, and I started getting inspired as a young adolescent. And I was fortunate to get some of the right stuff that would be utilized, and I started training, and I knew that this could make a difference because I wasn't the biggest, I wasn't the fastest, I wasn't the most skilled, but I figured if I worked harder, and this has kind of been my genre through my entire life, I could overcome my limitations and succeed against people who maybe didn't work as hard as I did. So it really started off in that kind of genre, and then continued on through into my college career, and then into my coaching career, and then actually now into my scientific career of the study of resistance training and how it can physically help development in athletes and also in other people as well.
If you did this today, you'd probably have 2 or 3 guys on your phys ed staff who could help you in producing a workout program and how to do this and how to train for specific purposes. You're a 15-year-old kid in Marshfield, Wisconsin in 1968, and there are no such programs, no such coaches, no literature out there. How do you go about teaching yourself how to do this and do it properly to maximize your athletic skills?
Well, it was very difficult. I think the first thing was, as you said, the times were that there were just a small, little pockets of information. So I guess at that time I looked to Bob Hoffman and Strength and Health and York Barbell Company. You looked at at the time, way before Arnold Schwarzenegger, what Joe Weider was doing with early bodybuilders. And then you looked at some of the athletic groups like LSU, where Jimmy Taylor came out of, and some of the Chicago Bears that did some things as well with weights, and you got information, and really it was from the magazines, and you made mistakes. If I go back and I look at and evaluate my training now compared to what I do, and when I work and study this stuff with collegiate and professional ranks, I would say I was lucky to get as good as I did, because I go back now I'd be 10 times better. But I think it was just the idea that this was search for information. It changed a lot, and nobody else was doing it. So it was a very small core of people at that time which were actually training that way. Even when I got to college, there wasn't a large number that were training with weights. Maybe more at UW La Crosse because we were a physical education school at the time than other places, but still a small percentage. And I think it really was fortunate. Maybe that's the case. In today's world, what I did back then wouldn't have made me much better than anything, but I was a hard worker, and I got enough good information from the York Barbell Company and some of the established types of trainers that I was able to put a program together that apparently worked.
Tell us about Jack Jansen coming to take over the Tiger football program and how that maybe changed the attitude of football at Marshfield High School.
Well, I got to give a lot of credit to Coach Jansen. I mean, he was a quintessential teacher. He was a quintessential coach. He was a quintessential person who could take and mold people's ideas and thoughts and give you a belief in the dreams of the future and open up the future to you. And I think that was important. I think he was number one, and I've found over the years now, he was number one, a very good teacher. He also understood offensive systems and defensive systems, and he understood how to match the personnel. And I think he studied hard the mistakes I think that Paul Richards made in really not being able to make that matchup. And I think sometimes that occurs. We've seen it all the time in football. But I think it was he as a teacher and just as a great mentor that to players that really made a difference. And I don't think I would have gone on to as much success without his support and without his mentorship, but also just as a very solid teacher, coach, and somebody who I then came back and coached with after my college career here in Marshfield for a year.
What was it like in this community when you did win that ball game with Eau Claire North and broke that long losing streak?
Well, it was at the same time the New York Mets won the World Series. So it was probably of a similar magnitude in 1968, I believe. I'm 69, I apologize. That when we won that game, it was pure euphoria. The city had never experienced a win in almost 4 years. The front page of the Marshfield News Herald said it's all over in big giant print on the front page. So I think that outside of us all getting crazy, jumping in the pool, jumping up and down, it was just a feeling that we hadn't experienced as football players, at least myself, since my grade school days. So for me it was 2 years. Other people it was 3. In some cases, some players hadn't not got the opportunity, but it was pure pandemonium, elation, and I've had a lot of in my collegiate career, a lot of big wins, and it was comparable to any of the big championship wins I had when I was a football player and 3 titles at UW La Crosse. So it was a very great time for a young kid, and great elation to see we finally accomplished something. And a credit to Coach Jansen for really putting it all together, and Coach Denny Myers, who was outstanding as well, and really helping to make this whole thing work.
Can you talk about some of the teammates you had during those years with the Tigers?
Well, I think, I had a lot of great teammates, and we all kind of put our nose to the grindstone. I think Rick Griffin was a teammate of mine both in high school and in college. He graduated a year before I did. Really was somebody who I learned to train with during the summers, and he trained with weights, and we continued to do this for years on later. And it was really great to have a training partner and somebody to go to the weight rooms on every night and jury nights. And he was an outstanding player that probably would have. He was basically as good as Mike Webster, but never had the same chances due to some injuries that Rick had, and went on to a great small college career as well. And I think Mike Salter was a great defensive back. Went on to coaching career at DC Everest. Terry Buss, what can be said? He was one of the all-state players that we had. A fantastic halfback, defensive player, gifted and talented as an athlete beyond anything that we had seen in Marshfield High School for years. Ken Schunk, our quarterback, was a great athlete, and we had just a lot of really good players that I played with. Donnie Ethmeyer went on to a coaching career as a guard. We had just a host of people that basically were helping out to try to make the team what it was. But I think it was a small band of people, and that's the things. Our numbers were always small, and we were still playing both ways through my entire high school career, which is kind of unusual today.
Any particular games stand out during your career with the Tigers?
Well, I think a number of them did. Obviously, the win with Eau Claire North. I think the victories against some of our people. We never had the opportunity to really beat DC Everest and Antigo during my career, which would have been 2 gems, really, from that perspective because of where they were in the field. I think the one game that I think we still stands out is the Eau Claire North victory. and then just the fact that we went from a 2-7 to a 4-4-1, and we were starting to put Marshfield for the following year to even a greater winning percentage after I had left. So I think it's just a compilation of improvement that was going on.
Can you kind of summarize your career at UW Lacrosse, where also you had some outstanding accomplishments?
Well, lacrosse, Roger Herring had been a coach at the Wisconsin Rapids Lincoln, and he went down to UW Lacrosse, and as he told it at the new stadium opening here a few weeks back in this fall, he now has the Roger Herring Stadium, Veterans Memorial Field. He said, you were my first recruit, and I think he looked at the kind of the picture of what I was basically as a strength trained athlete and somebody who was going to be able to help him. I think he also admitted that he probably should have played me on defense, where it was probably more suited, but I ended up playing center, and really seeing what masses of solid players mean to a program. In the 4 years we were there, I think we only lost 6 games total. We won 3 conference championships, and we should have won 4, and we had 1 bad game against Oshkosh my sophomore year. We would have had 4 conference championships in a row. But I think the key thing is that we had just outstanding players from the Valley Conference. Dave Sager, who was all-state wide receiver. Rick Griffin went on to be one of our top the offensive tackles in our line, and from Joe Wagner, Guy Arkin, all the top players that came from the state of Wisconsin and outside of the state that gave us just outstanding players in numbers. When I went to my first practice in lacrosse back in 1971, we had 220 players out for football. There were 14 strings at every position. So it was just amazing to me on a team that I played with. Maybe if we had 35, 40 guys, it was pretty good by the end of my Marshfield career. So it was really numbers of high-quality players and just powerful offensive and defensive schemes with Coach Christensen in defense, Coach Haring on offense, just outstanding on all levels. And I think that's the excellence that proved to put him into the College Football Hall of Fame by the time he ended his career. So I was glad to be a part of that. We had some great victories in championships, and it was exciting to be in the playoff game in '73 and against Elon College. And then my last game of my whole senior career was against Morehead State, when we had a little quarterback beat us by the name of Phil Sims, who threw 2 long touchdown bombs, and that's where I ended my career and as a football player. And it's quite interesting, but interesting times.
It sounds like you made an effort to do some coaching after your college playing career, but eventually went in another direction. Tell us about some of the decisions you had to make in that period.
Well, I think I was very interested in being a coach, and that was my intention. And I came back after my college career, and I coached at Marshfield Junior High School, and Coach Jansen. I was very ambitious, and I wanted to make more, so I went back to graduate school, and I helped out and was coaching as a grad student with the Wyoming Cowboys, and did some help, in that aspect. And then I went from there to Carroll College, where I coached small college football, and really was excited about it and coaching. I've been doing that for, on the junior high school, actually the major college and then small college levels. And then I had to make a decision, and I think part of the decision was, I was really into this physical conditioning and how to train people and make them as good as they can be as a coach. And I wanted to study it more scientifically. How can we do it? What's the basis of it? And I knew I needed to become a scientist. So it was either that or go maybe large college football coaching. Now, a lot of the guys I coach camps with and everything in the summer, they're some of the major college coaches that you see today. And definitely the amount of money in the sport has changed from what it was in 1977 to 1980 when I was coaching at Carroll. But I I went back to school, got my degree, and it was really pushed by this idea of wanting to be the world's best scientist in the study of strength and conditioning. And I think at that point, that decision was a successful one, and I've gone on to an academic career, that's been very blessed by being very successful with that at major schools, including Penn State University and University of Connecticut, and where I'm currently at. And so it's been an evolution, but it's all started with the interest you had in trying to make yourself a better athlete with weights.
Former Marshfield Tiger football standout Bill Kraemer inducted into the Marshfield Tiger Athletic Hall of Fame in 2009. This is Gene DeLisio reporting for WDLB and WOSQ.